welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I can feel it. Can you feel it? There's like a consistency that's happening again here. Here's another new episode is live. People get to hear that. Spread the word, people. We're signing papers. We're going to be back.
We're back. We're coming back. And we'll be back with regular releases this week or next week, most likely. And that is likely going to be 2 episodes of Crawlspace a week and at least 1 of Missing a week. So make sure you go check out our other show, Missing, as well. That's a regular show. And Lance, these episodes are called Torn from the Headlines, and I know it might be a little confusing for some of our audience, and where we came out of nowhere with a news episode about a month ago, and we're doing it again. Same format with Dr. David Perlmutter and Chloe Canter, and this is a format that we're sort of figuring out that David created, and we're likely going to be doing this weekly very soon.
Right, because news does break by the minute here in the world. So we wanted to take advantage of that and also take advantage of the great relationship that we have with Dr. David Perlmutter and Chloe and work through this new concept and see if this was a dynamic that worked well with the, like you said, the torn from the headlines, the current news type genre. And I'm feeling like it is. I'm feeling like we're getting our footing underneath us and we're making sure that all of the information that we're trying to cover is responsibly addressed. And we are learning the story for the most part, I guess, kind of in real time. So this one we cover Matthew Perry's death because of those charges that were just released. And now it's moved into more of a criminal phase, and as the public's learning about this, we're learning about this. And I think that having Chloe and Dr. Perlmutter on to work our brains around everything that's happening, both from the media side, how it's being covered, and from just the ethical and, I guess, moral side of taking advantage of celebrity with a drug addiction. So that's what we're doing here. Hopefully people like it. We're going to try to do it, like you said, we're going to try to do this on a consistent basis.
Very cool. All right, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for listening. I hope you enjoy this. We're going to be back regularly very soon, and make sure to follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
All right, we're going to break for a quick commercial, and we'll be right back with Dr. David Perlmutter and Chloe Canter.
Hello and welcome to Torn from the Headlines, brought to you by the Crawlspace Network. This is a podcast where we shine a spotlight on the latest and the greatest and the scariest breaking news in the world of mystery, murder, mayhem, and the missing. While we examine cases that are just coming into focus within the last week or so, they may very well be ones that you haven't heard of that we think deserve more publicity, or they may be new news concerning famous old cases. Torn from the Headlines is originated by David D. Perlmutter, and I'd like to welcome our guests here today, Dr. David D. Perlmutter and Chloe Canter. How are you both doing today?
Hi. Thank you.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. I think we have some interesting topics to discuss today, so I'm looking forward to it.
Today, we are going to be speaking about the unfortunate death of Matthew Perry, who is an actor in Hollywood, very well known for his role on the sitcom Friends. And this is a death that happened in October of 2023. And there was some mystery surrounding how he died, and some of that mystery has been answered in the last week or so.
Well, I will say that when I first heard of the death, it was shocking, but the mystery around it presumably almost immediately went away for me when I started reading about it, because he's got a well-known addiction problem. He was found in a hot tub, and it seemed initially, okay, he relapsed, he fell off the wagon and overdosed, and unfortunately we hear this so many times, especially in pop culture, in the media. It was tragic. He was so young, but after I heard about the circumstances, I just kind of put that chapter away. I filed it away and said Matt Perry was the latest one to OD on the drugs that he had been using intensely recreationally. Was that the same thing with you guys?
I guess I'm always a little bit surprised when I see arrests made after somebody overdoses and dies. I feel like this is such a prevalent issue. The epidemic of drug addiction in the western part of our country. Meth is more of an issue. Heroin and opiates seem to be more of an issue on the East Coast. But I remember also when Mac Miller died, a bunch of arrests were made after the fact. And I believe that the charges specifically were like drug distribution resulting in death. And in Mac Miller's case, the oxycodone pills were counterfeit and laced with fentanyl, which Mac Miller apparently was not aware of. So, they were charged for being responsible for his death, essentially. In this case, it does seem that Matthew Perry was fully aware of what he was ingesting, which was ketamine, which has never been more accessible as a, medical treatment for depression and other mental illnesses. And he was legally prescribed that, but it seems that things went downhill from there based on, these most recent reports this week.
Yeah, I think what you just said about the charges that came about recently, that's the part that is like ripped from the headlines for me, because I filed it away and I said, this is a tragedy. And then, it's a few weeks later, you start hearing these rumblings about maybe there's some murder charges happening here, some manslaughter charges, and then they actually filed charges. So now we are ripping. Do you guys want to rip or tear from the headlines? What's better?
I like rip.
I think I found that one already had 7 podcasts and one didn't, so that's why we're using torn for now. I don't know. We can decide. I guess as the official old man of the panel, I want to bring in a little historical perspective. When I was growing up, there was a famous book by a Hollywood child actor who grew up to be sort of like a student of Hollywood decadence, called Kenneth Anger. It's called Hollywood Babylon. I mean, most recently, not many people saw, but there was a film, Babylon, about Hollywood. And Hollywood has always been accused of being, biblically Babylon. Anyway, this book, Hollywood Babylon, sort of reviewed some of the famous scandals of Hollywood of the 20s, 30s, 40s, Fatty Arbuckle, and other people who, mysterious stars and associated with stars, people who ended up dead under either mysterious circumstances or murder or drugs. And in the old Hollywood studio system, the studios were sort of in charge of protecting stars in 2 ways. One is that they would literally try to, make sure he doesn't get cocaine. Like, the orders would be for everybody around the star, like, he's susceptible to cocaine, don't let him get cocaine because he's a big box office star. And then the other way they would protect is that, of course, this is before the internet, before any independent media, and they could call the paper, there were only 3 or 4 papers, the magazine, and say, hey, could you not run this? We'll give you some other gossip on somebody else if you promise not to run this story about the arrest of our big star on marijuana charges. So that system has sort of disappeared, and stars are on their own now. And obviously, there's people don't want to have bad things released about them, but it's a different world in terms of finding out. And of course, people are much more public, as in like Matthew Perry, has gone since his starring in Friends and being probably one of the biggest stars in television, has gone through a very public path. I mean, the destruction of some of his friendships and his going to rehab and then in and out, and he wrote a book. And so this isn't a surprise in terms of the outcome. It's sort of a surprise in terms of some of the issues that it raises about like how he got to the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And before we started, Tim and I were talking, and on the surface, this article that started this conversation between the four of us felt like it was going to be detailed and we would have to do some research in the background, but this was so much deeper than at least Tim and I expected when we started reading into it. I had no idea. I don't really even know where to start on this, but can we just like talk about ketamine for a little bit? Like, what is ketamine used for?
That's exactly where I was going to suggest starting. My understanding of it was that it was a cat tranquilizer. And I know that people called it Special K. That was one of the street names for it. But apparently it's a hallucinogen as well, which was surprising to me when I looked further into it.
Right. So how is that used as an antidepressant? And again, I know listeners out there are probably thinking like, how do you not know this yet? But I think that's part of the concept of this show is like we are literally trying to figure this out almost in real time.
I can read from this site here, dea.gov. Ketamine distorts the perception of sight and sound and makes the user feel disconnected and not in control. It is referred to as a, quote, dissociative anesthetic hallucinogen, end quote, because it makes patients feel detached from their pain and environment.
So it's heavily dissociative in its effects, and I think users have described it as dreamlike in its effects. It has been used medically. Tim, you had mentioned, I think, animals, cats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's been used for like short-term medication for animals and people for, pain and I believe even anesthesia. But now the kind of new age medicine has seen its use in the treatment of chronic pain and in migraines. And most recently, I think I would describe it as still in the experimental stages, but people with long-term mental health struggles have used ketamine infusions in efforts to treat a treatment-resistant diagnosis.
I know we're going to go in this direction at some point, and that was a really great point, Chloe. We're going to talk about the role of people in someone's life, especially in Hollywood, the personal assistant. And I'll say at this point that I did spend 5 years in Hollywood trying to make it as a screenwriter before I took my academic path. And I had one ABC after school special to my credit. So that's I was on the D list, but I did learn a lot about and have subsequently been interested in the culture of like personal assistants. And maybe some of you have seen that show Entourage about like people around the star. And going back to what Chloe said, at least my pharmacy professor friends have pointed out to me that there are so many drugs which have multiple purposes and can do multiple things. And I was watching the murder mystery show, the sort of Columbo Today, Elsbeth on CBS. It's like one of the few hits on CBS. And I noticed that somebody was murdered by being given a bottle full of lorazepam. Lorazepam is a prescribed sleeping pill, but if you read everything it does about 30 other things, and that's why if you get lorazepam, you can only get 30 at a time, and then either one or two prescriptions, you have to get a new prescription from your doctor. It's a controlled substance. And so that's what's really interesting is like who has access to these so-called controlled substances. Well, you can bet that some people, because of their money or power, are able to maybe go to multiple places or get things that like the ordinary person going to the pharmacist wouldn't be able to do.
Right. You mentioned personal assistants. And so a personal assistant named Kenneth, he was Matthew Perry's personal assistant for over 25 years. Is one of the 5 people who were charged with his death. And you make great points, David, because it says here in some articles that, he had various responsibilities, including booking his medical appointments and making sure he took his lawfully prescribed medication. So that is a weird role as a job. And then, you're on some level, obviously, you kind of have to be a friend, right?
Yeah, we can't comment on obviously the personal circumstances. That's going to come out in court. But I'm sure you've seen in TV shows, maybe you have people in your life, but I saw on firsthand, like being a personal assistant was a great job. And then sometimes it wasn't a great job. And, there's a saying in medicine, again, my doctor friends have said to me that there's two kinds of people who get the worst care in America. It's the extremely poor and the extremely rich. And the reason the extremely rich get poor care is because they can get anything they want. So it's whether you and I go to the doctor, and if we're under a regular insurance, the doctor's only going to give us what is covered by the insurance, but if you're super rich and super connected, you can like ask, and there's a whole history of doctors being charged and other things. And so if you're a personal assistant, I'm not defending anybody or offending anybody, but like you're under a lot of pressure. Like if your star says at 5 a.m., I need some raspberries, you go out and drive 2 hours to get some raspberries. If they say, I need something else, you got to make a decision about whether you're going to be the guy or the gal who's going to get that something else, or you're not going to be the personal assistant. Again, I'm not trying to build a defense or something, but that's part of the culture there.
Well, just for the record, when Tim says he needs raspberries at 5 a.m, I am the first phone call, and those raspberries are delivered in a very timely fashion. But Chloe, I need to get a psychological opinion, and this is not prearranged. Chloe does not know what question I'm about to ask. I barely know it. What is it when you are a celebrity and you have access to all of this money and you can get pretty much an endless supply of drugs? Is there something that is, to use the word again, disassociative, is there something in there that justifies it in the celebrity's head when, one, the drug you're getting is legal, and two, you're not physically going to get it? You're just telling somebody to get it. Does that lessen the impression on themselves that they are an addict and they need to stop, or they've fallen off the wagon?
I think regardless of wealth or socioeconomic status, if someone is in the throes of substance misuse because of addiction and dependence, people are willing to justify it however they can, if they are currently using. So if someone does have access to money and staff and influence and, star power in this case, it's pretty uncommon, but you really don't have many barriers to getting what you want, especially if you're not doing it firsthand. I'm sure that could have been a way that he was justifying it to himself, specifically with his, prescription and prescribed treatment for it. But of course, his assistant had no medical training or licensure to be administering intravenous ketamine to his boss. But like what Dr. Perlmutter was saying very succinctly, there's a power imbalance there. And that's really interesting to note because the basis of the charges against all of these arrested defendants now were that they took advantage of Matthew Perry's vulnerability because he was an addict. So they're suggesting that there is a power imbalance going the other way, which I think as far as the doctors and the prescribers go is probably true. But when it comes to Matthew Perry's assistant, I think when you have a celebrity boss and they're telling you to jump, you say, how high?
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. I want to add that there were 2 doctors charged in the death as well, Dr. Mark Chavez, and Perry and Chavez never met. And apparently on his website, his role is described as helping his clients obtain optimum health and longevity through personalized coaching. So I'm a little confused on how he's involved at all here. And then there's a Dr. Salvador Placencia, might have pronounced that incorrectly, but this was really egregious. There were apparently text messages, one from September of 2023, only a month before Perry died, where he sent a message saying, I wonder how much this moron will pay, apparently about the ketamine. Like he was looking at it as an opportunity to profit off of Mr. Perry.
That's the way that I really saw it too, as far as the medical practitioners went. Those text messages are very damning evidence of exploiting someone's vulnerability. So I think that they're in trouble. And I think obviously his assistant's in big trouble too. But when you take into account what that dynamic is like, I do think he is possibly less culpable. We don't know all of the facts of the case. We don't know the whole relationship. And as the doc said, we will learn more as it unfolds in court unless they take a plea deal or something.
Well, also, what an idiotic thing. I mean, it's ironic that they're calling Matthew Perry an idiot and seeing how much they can charge him when they're texting this. Like, have they never read the news? Have they never heard of Prince and Michael Jackson? Like, did they not think that he might overdose and this could come back on them? What, like, it's just ironic to me that that's the text message. What, like, they're the idiots who are incriminating themselves without any foresight there. It's so frustrating.
Well, Lance, I think it sort of suggests that this is not some anomalous situation that just happened once. It's part of the culture. And I mean, the answer to your question is, yeah, they probably didn't, because it's a lot of people are doing it. I mean, again, not making any individual accusations, but, you know, we have, unfortunately, as Chloe pointed out, we have a terrible drug crisis in small towns in the Midwest, and we have a terrible drug crisis in Hollywood elites. I mean, there's, you know, you pick which drug crisis, but there's multiple ones, and people are making mistakes in Gary, Indiana, just as much as they're making in the Hollywood Hills. The question is, and this goes to true crime, really, is that it's interesting how at first we didn't classify this as a crime. We just said it's a tragedy, and oh yeah, poor guy, he's been having all this trouble. And you have to wonder, the police really kept this under the rose bushes, used to be said, is that I did not hear that this was an investigation or there was suspicious circumstances. Maybe that was out there and I just, you know, not paying enough attention. But this sort of dropped big there. And I think this is something else that we have to, for those of us who are interested in the progress of investigations, is sometimes we don't know there is an investigation, and we shouldn't be too quick to classify something as one thing when we don't know who's investigating what for it to be something else.
And I did want to mention there were a couple of other people who were charged in the case here. Eric Fleming, 54-year-old, who distributed the ketamine that killed Perry, and then someone named Jasveen Sangha, which apparently the authorities call her the ketamine queen of North Hollywood. And she was, I take it, a prolific drug dealer in that area. And some of the charges here are interesting as well. This Dr. Placentia was charged with 1 count of conspiracy to distribute ketamine, 7 counts of distribution of ketamine, and 2 counts of altering and falsifying documents or records related to the federal investigation into Perry's death. But he was released on a $100,000 bond. So I wonder, are these going to be 5 different trials for these defendants?
Right. What a great question. Are we going to have 5 different trials? I don't even know. How does this work? Like, you can't have. Can you have 5 defendants?
Well, in the legal system, it's often like who flips first, right? I mean, the authorities want to get the maximum conviction, but not necessarily of everybody. And like who, I'm really guessing they have 5 different attorneys, and they're not a united front. You know, we all go down together. I don't think any group of defendants have ever felt, you know, let's all go together to jail. That has not been a sentiment, I think.
Well, unless you're in the mafia, you know, and it's organized crime, and that's the code. But in this case, it's like
I think that
person for
code
themselves.
stopped in the 70s, as far as I know. I mean, everybody flipped in the 80s, so
that you know of.
Yeah,
this is more like disorganized crime, it seems.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, opportunistic, disorganized crime.
And apparently Placentia reopened his office this week. So he's back to practicing.
Gotta pay the bills.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people are aware, that he is this doctor who's been charged in this case and potentially doing dangerous things.
I imagine being charged with a crime as a doctor, he would be under investigation by the medical board. So maybe he's just trying to get some hours in before his license is suspended or revoked. I'm just surprised it hasn't already been suspended.
Well, he's innocent until proven guilty, of course, in our system. But it really does go back to this idea about whether the justice system works for everybody. And we always have ideals and everything in this country about nobody is above the law, justice is blind. But we know, in fact, that money and power and position can have great influences on outcomes. And obviously this case would not have received attention if this had been just some unfortunate street person in North Hollywood, who probably do pass away pretty regularly, as much as they do in Central Ohio. But on the other hand, probably somebody wouldn't have as much ability to have access to all of these things if they had been poorer too. So it's sort of a trade-off there, I guess. And I guess my question to you all, as the true crime experts, is you Lance and Tim, you've been just, I think this is the reason I contacted you in the first place. I was so impressed by how you wanted to have justice for people who didn't have the resources in terms of maybe media attention or rewards, or maybe living in a big city or something like that. And when you see a case like this, I have not seen like his family come forward. I haven't seen some of the things that we usually see in these cases, like the sister or the father. I'm not sure what that says, but like, is this an untypical case for like the notoriety and the anonymity at the same time?
That's a good question. I guess that is a little surprising. I haven't really dug in to find out if his family has spoken up anytime recently, but there are some, they definitely made some comments back last October when he died initially, stating they were heartbroken and a lot of the things that you would expect to hear.
Yeah, but that's a good question and a good observation, because I think the three of us, we met Chloe when we were working on Brianna Maitland's disappearance, and the area in which Brianna grew up had a drug problem, and she didn't come from incredible means. She didn't come from incredible wealth, and I think that's something that we take with us when we look at these stories. And I didn't think about that until you mentioned it, David. What gets me about this story isn't the wealth that he had or the power that he could just get anything. It's the fact that he was taken advantage of. And I'll just compare it again to Brianna. Regardless of wealth and power and age and popularity, someone took advantage of her. And I think that's sort of the underlying theme, is like, it just sucks. This is an enormously talented individual whose life was destroyed by drugs, and people took advantage of that, even though he was trying his best to stay on course. And you're going to slip up here and there, and that's just the human story. So I think that's kind of what resonated when first his death happened, and then the news of people are, very responsible for it and took advantage of him.
Yeah, it seems like his family has spoken out in the past few weeks, basically just showing support for law enforcement, and that's pretty much it. It's saying they're still heartbroken.
I'd love to find out something additional about ketamine, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. You know what I was going to say about ketamine is that I hadn't really known it to be a drug in which people were overdosing and dying.
Like abusing.
So I think the hot tub that Matthew Perry was in had a lot to do with his death at that time. I don't know if maybe he would have, just like passed out on the floor or on a bed or something like that if he wasn't in the hot tub.
Yeah, you're thinking the same thoughts I'm having, because I read in the article that his the level of ketamine was the same level as it would be during general anesthesia. And people aren't dying during general anesthesia due to ketamine. So it was a number of things. I think he had like pulmonary heart issues as well. I think Matt Perry had some heart problems, and he was like a 2-pack-a-day smoker. So a bunch of factors. I'm curious what that level is for somebody who's under general anesthesia. Does it? I don't know. Can we even answer that?
This might add a little information. You can inject ketamine into your body in multiple different ways. It can be injected with a syringe, liquid mixed with liquids, powder that is snorted or mixed in drinks, or smoked even. So that seems like a very wide range of ways you can actually ingest that drug. I would have to imagine, I think with most drugs, the effects are different considering which way you use it, I think. Does that make sense? So I think his personal assistant was injecting him with the drug. I'm not sure if that's what happened before he passed away, but at least in one of these articles it mentioned that was one of the things the personal assistant did do, one of his duties.
So when a patient is getting ketamine administered to them during a surgery for general anesthesia, how is that administered? I mean, they're not smoking it. Is it intravenous?
Yeah, it's through the intravenous, yeah.
Okay.
I certainly know in the cases of insulin diabetes that family members will inject someone who's diabetic, especially if they're a child or somebody of older, diminished capacity or something like that. So it's not surprising that somebody who I do not believe that, as far as maybe I'm missing something. I do not believe the personal assistant was like a nurse, a registered nurse or something, or had any. But obviously people do inject other people with something completely legally. It's just that that's not. I mean, I'd rather have that sounds like a pretty heavy duty thing, and something that's used in anesthesia and surgery to just have a guy.
Yeah.
And then going back to what you guys were asking, you go to the pharmacy and whatever you get, they usually give you like a 10-page single space thing of all the possible side effects, and don't mix this with, oatmeal or something like that. So, you sort of hope that people get the guidance, because there are so many, as a doctor friend of mine told me, that, we have tens of thousands more drugs today, pharmaceuticals available than we did, say, 50 years ago. And so don't mix this with this. But I think probably not getting in a hot tub after having anything that might make you have some altered consciousness is probably a good tip there. And, beer, I mean, obviously a lot of people do that, but not more than one.
Don't ever get into a hot tub. It's a germ pool.
But also, a lot of times if someone has a beer in the hot tub or something, they're not usually alone, maybe. Obviously, sometimes they could be. I wonder, because this assistant, Kenneth Iwamasa, 59 years old, was Perry's personal assistant for over 25 years. So he is accused of injecting Perry with the ketamine. And apparently he left the house. So it makes me wonder, maybe he didn't know Perry was going to hop into the pool, or makes me just wonder how often this happened.
I think anytime someone is taking a downer, something that's sedating, when you're in a really hot environment like a heated pool, you are more likely to go orthostatic and pass out. And because of the levels of ketamine that were in Matthew Perry's system, it does seem kind of negligent to leave him in that condition. But at the same time, because Matthew Perry was a decades-long drug addict, I know that when that's the case, the amount of anesthesia that you need to actually be like knocked out for something like surgery is much higher, because your tolerance to substances in general is higher. So perhaps that's the dose that would work for the average person, but maybe he wasn't like completely knocked out like the average person would be because of his dependence. And it could have just been like a situation of, because he was already sedated, passing out and not being able to, come up to the surface. He was found floating face down, I believe. And there are a lot of historical celebrity drug overdose deaths that are, in conjunction with accidental drowning, like Aaron Carter, Whitney Houston, where if they weren't in water, the outcome may have been different or maybe not, but they were all on sedating substances.
And then you brought up the other part is that we don't know the history here of him. There are many famous celebrity deaths. I'm thinking of from the Sex Pistols in my time, Sid Vicious and his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, who he killed his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, and then he went to jail. He got out and he immediately went back to the amount that he'd been using before he went to jail. Well, that killed him because he was no longer able to take that level. So that's a story of quite a number of deaths, I believe, is people who've gone clean and then go back, but they don't go back to what they took when they started this whatever substance. And so we know that he, unfortunately went through an odyssey that wasn't like continuously up, increasing dosages. I think he went through periods of like being off, right? So that's again just outlining how dangerous all of this is, and to be alone, which I think is something that really is important. Is a lot of times it seems that in these murder mystery or this kind of a death where nobody who's accused of being culpable in his death was around, right? As far as we know, he was actually physically alone. And it's sort of sad when we have somebody who we shared, because like I didn't watch Friends, but like it was the big TV show of the time, I guess, along with some other ones, but in terms of an ensemble, and probably everybody of my generation and maybe a couple of generations afterwards can name you just say Rachel, or something like that, and it just brings up it's sort of sad sometimes when you see these people who like were shared with tens of millions of people who die alone. And that's very famous in Hollywood too.
Yeah. And you had brought up a point about Sid Vicious and how the amount of drugs that he took once he came out of prison, he went to the same level that killed him. I think I read that Matthew Perry was 19 months sober and there was no other drugs found in the home. So he hadn't been using. So that just goes right in line with what you're saying. All of the circumstances came together to make this one the lethal dose. And don't lie, David, you watch Friends. You in your bookshelf behind you, the entire season is on DVD.
What were you, a Frasier guy or something? What?
Definitely a Frasier guy.
Not my demographic. No, I'm sorry. I was watching Masterpiece Theater, of course. So.
Of course. Like you can only watch one thing.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Yeah, it's a great point about dying alone and being so famous. It is quite sad. I remember I was living in Los Angeles when Robin Williams passed away, and I swear that was the saddest day I ever experienced out there. Of course, I wasn't there when Kobe Bryant died, but yeah, there was just a general sadness because you felt like, everyone there was like, wow, well, they're trying to reach a level of success like Robin Williams did. And if he dies by his own hand, so miserable, what the hell are we all doing here,
Yeah, like the funniest man who ever existed, at one point in his career. Yeah, just reach that pinnacle.
Yeah, like if that's what we're striving for, why are we striving for it,
Yeah.
I think this goes back to some of the discussions I've certainly heard on all of your shows before about you really just don't know somebody. This is part of this discussion where a crime, murder, mystery, whatever will happen, missing, and you will see, my favorite place to read about this is Reddit. You will see all of these people saying this person didn't do something that was logical. right? Or this person didn't do something that made sense. And I always have a problem with that because who knows what makes sense to anybody to do in any situation. We were talking about the two Dutch girls who disappeared and then were found dead in Panama. And then, of course, all of these cases, they hinge often on people sitting in their living rooms or sitting here and saying, well, why did she do this? Or why did they do that? But we weren't there. We don't know why somebody does anything, right? At the end of the day. I mean, even no psychologist will say, yes, I will tell you exactly why somebody who I never interviewed, even my parents were both psychologists, and they would tell me, that even they don't know what's in somebody's heart, right? So, or in somebody's brain. So I think this is one of those lessons, is that Matthew Perry in his public life, I mean, he was a fine comedic actor. I saw him. I think I did see him in a couple of films he made afterwards. He was always and he seemed like a happy guy. That's the other thing, right? We just don't know other people's lives, and that's why in other cases, like when non-celebrities have something terrible to them, it's good to avoid the speculation of like, well, they didn't do something logical or reasonable, because human beings are illogical and unreasonable all the time.
Did you all watch the Friends reunion or hear anything about the Friends reunion and how everybody reacted to him? I mean, everybody being the rest of the cast, being concerned about him. And then when he started telling them how he had this like crippling anxiety to perform, like every time he needed to be funny, it was almost like it kept snowballing and he couldn't, in his own head, he couldn't rise to the occasion. So I'm curious, like, how does that, and it kind of goes to what you were saying, Tim, with Robin Williams. If we're all striving to do something to the best of our ability, he's a comedic actor. He just nailed the most successful comedy show, or one of the most successful comedy shows in television history. What kind of pressure, I mean, does that put on somebody? Obviously, we see it in the results here. But, I don't know, maybe Chloe can help me out with this. Like, it seems like the other cast members were able to deal with it. So what's the difference? Like, upbringing, nature, nurture?
I think sometimes it's as simple as it's just not for everybody. And my understanding is Matthew Perry is from the industry. I think his father was an actor, and that's how he connected with his father. And then his stepfather is true crime icon Keith Morrison. So he has this, family history of being in the show business industry. He has natural talent, but that doesn't really mean that it was for him, and that was maybe not his dream, but a way for him to be connected to his family. I don't know if everybody's read Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, but it was a bestseller for a very long time, like number one for a really long time. And I highly recommend it for everybody. But this actress who was on iCarly, that's kind of her claim to fame. She was a child actress, but that was her mother's dream, and her mother really pushed that on her, and that's how she connected to her mother. But she hated it so much, absolutely hated it, that like the moment her mom died, she was like, I'm done acting, and pursued being an author, and I believe screenwriting as well. So if you don't like what you're doing, and the very nature of your job description fills you with this like anxiety and dread to the point where you feel like you need to self-medicate, most people would pursue a career change. But there's a lot of benefits to being a rich celebrity. You have access to everything that you want. And when you are an addict, having that stream of income is kind of irresistible, because otherwise you're in the same position as most other addicts in America, which are you have to compromise yourself in many ways to support your addiction. But he had a job that just happened to make an insane amount of money.
Yeah, and I also wonder if performing on Friends in front of a live studio audience had anything to do with any of this, because there's such an energy transferal when you're performing in front of a crowd, but also much more nerve-wracking than performing in a movie, for example, where your only audience is the crew and you can mess up as many times as you want. So I don't know, just throwing that out there.
I think it's also interesting how he achieved something that several million people in the greater Los Angeles basin and New York and maybe America and planet Earth would dream of, right? I mean, you go to Los Angeles and like I did, and you see all sorts of people. Like literally everyone waiting tables has a screenplay, or has a casting call at 3:00 and has to leave early. I mean, it especially in Los Angeles in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that was it still is true in some ways, and yet it's almost a stereotype that the people who have achieved that may not be happy with it. That this is not something they really want to do, but as Chloe was saying, that they're sort of locked into it. That maybe through family circumstances or just because we forget that also that these stars, and the personal assistant is a very good example. You're often supporting a lot of people. This is true of NBA stars, sports stars. Like you've got. It's not just the classic entourage, but a lot of these people are supporting. Now, he came from a family that had a lot of success, but quite a number of child stars, for example. I remember there was a story about the young sister in Michael J. Fox's show, Family Ties, is like that, about how she was supporting her family. There's a lot of stories like that in Hollywood about like the 12-year-old is supporting like a family, and talk about the pressure there, right? And yeah, not everybody likes to be singing, dancing in front of an audience as something that they enjoy, but they might be so good at it that they hide the pain that they're feeling achieving it, which is something that I guess you deserve extra credit as an actor that you're able to achieve despite this agony that you're going through.
Yeah, you just made me think of Amy Winehouse. That's one of the most tragic stories that's out there. If you ever see the documentary, I think it's just called Amy. It's unbelievable what her father did. It's unbelievable how he just literally watched her waste away. And the last few weeks of her life, she is just like a shell of herself. I mean, she's a small person anyway, and she's just pumping as much drugs into her body and as much alcohol into her body as possible. And that's a hugely talented individual who died, I think, at 27 or 24, like whatever that.
Yeah, the famous 27, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's been debunked, but but there are a lot of stars of music and 27. I mean, again, it's been debunked that is like when stars or musicians pass away, but a lot have, and it is about this sort of transition between childhood and adulthood and responsibilities. And so many of them, the weight of fame, the weight of people depending on them, the weight of people looking at them and judging them all the time was too great.
Yeah. I would also say the loss of control too. To get to the Amy Winehouse example again, it was all about her dad. She had to perform for her dad, and she had lost all control of her life. And the same thing happened with Britney Spears. And then the media jumps in, and they'll raise you up just enough to just tear you down to raise you up again. And God, I couldn't imagine that. I mean,
there's a famous line from the great old movie Sunset Boulevard, which is sort of about this topic. And for those who haven't seen it, it's about a fading Hollywood movie star who's trying to get one last big role. And Cecil B. DeMille, the famous director who plays himself in the movie, this is a very old movie, says, I think I'm paraphrasing here, "You have no idea how much damage publicity agents working 24 hours a day can do to somebody."
Yeah, oh man, Sunset Boulevard, what a movie. Classic. What a great flick. You know what? I wanted to conclude here with just a favorite memory of Matthew Perry. It was one of his movies, actually. I am a fan of Friends, but I really loved The Whole Nine Yards. And I imagine that was one of the movies you were mentioning that you saw, David, because that movie was a big hit at the time, and he was just hilarious in that movie.
So I highly recommend people check out the bloopers behind the scenes of Friends. You asked what a good memory is of Matthew Perry, and it obviously goes to Friends, but if you ever watch the bloopers, especially his, like whenever he's involved in these bloopers, it's unbelievable. So he wasn't only talented like on script. When he would mess up, or when someone else would mess up, and there's a great one where like he couldn't stop tripping going into a scene, and it's unbelievable, and it just shows like a really human side to him. I always get a good laugh when I watch those behind the scenes bloopers.
I was a fan of Friends back in the day when it was on. That was like a childhood show of mine. I don't resonate with it as much now. I think the show's had some criticisms now that times have changed. You'll see many articles about how it's aged like milk, but he was iconic in that role, like very much so. Like people still will like quote his what was his line? Or it was more of like his tonality, like, could I be any more of this? Like that was kind of his iconic line, and people quote that all the time and might not even really know exactly what the origin is, but he was very funny, very fresh, such a dry, sarcastic sense of humor, and brought a lot to that show. But you could also sadly see the progression of his health problems as the show went on. His appearance changed and his presence changed, and I know he tried very hard to come out of it and did what he could to make positive change in society. I believe he funded a rehab facility and wrote his book, I think, with some motivation to inspire other people. I don't think he wanted to go down like this. He wanted to have a legacy that was bigger than his addiction. But I still think, I think his accomplishments and his legacy outside of that are still significant and still resonate with people.
I think one of the reasons the show was so popular is also a tribute to him and the other actors, is that it was an ensemble. And many shows there's a star, and then everyone is sort of subservient and feeding the ego of the star, and you sort of get a sense that like it's all about the one, right? But on that show, they played off each other so well. They were cast in almost like classic Greek drama or comedy. They were types, and everybody identified with a type. The show Modern Family, for me, which I liked a lot, was sort of like that, where everybody, there was a specific type, and you could identify with that. And I certainly know generationally, everybody had their friends person that they were. Oh, I'm more of a Phoebe than you're more of a Rachel, and that's the classic, literally thousands of years old classic that makes audiences interested. And I think you're saying something else too, is that he apparently was a very generous person, generous professionally, generous personally, generous in terms of like the community. And so I hope that that's his legacy, and whatever resolution this comes in, that we can pay tribute to the joy he gave to a lot of people.
Well said. Thank you very much for joining us here today, Lance, David, and Chloe. And thanks a lot for listening, everybody out there. We really appreciate it.